Good morning. Today's date is January 22nd, 2008. My name is Thomas Murray. Today I will be conducting an oral history interview with Beatrice Selig for the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Dalton Council on Aging. This interview is being held at the Dalton Community Television Studio in Dalton, Massachusetts. Good morning, Bea.
Good morning.
Bea, could you give us your full name, spelling your last name, please?
Beatrice Selig, S-E-L-I-G. Beatrice.
Your maiden name was?
Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R.
That was at the time you went
At the
into
time
this.
I was in service, it
Right.
was Singer, yes.
And where do you presently live?
In Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Okay. And what's your birth date and where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and is it necessary to use my birth date?
Oh, you're still young.
7/23/23.
7/23/23. Did you grow up and go to school there, Bea?
Yes, yes.
And what schools would you have attended there?
The public school system, we went to PS 100.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had 2 years at Abraham Lincoln High School, and then 2 years at New Utrecht High School. And then I got my professional training, my early professional training at that time, Kings County School of Nursing.
Mm-hmm. So why did you have to go to night school?
My father died when I was 16. And in those days, you were left, it was an accident.
Yeah.
And we were not, in a sense, financially prepared for it.
Right,
and being 16 years of age, I had to leave school and help take care of the family, in a sense.
Now, before your dad passed, what was it like growing up in Brooklyn, New York at that time?
I guess we were as poor as church mice, but then everybody else was just as poor, so we really never realized we were. I have to say this, growing up in the neighborhood, we grew up in a neighborhood, and it was a very nurturing neighborhood. People knew of your family, and they knew you as a result, you were part of the family. And it was very nurturing. As I said, I don't recall ever feeling isolated or anything of that nature. Yeah. And we had all the amenities we needed. There was a public library. I remember the years I was 13 using even I was a Zane Grey fan and couldn't find enough Zane Grey in the library. I even went into and paid to read the book, a private, they had a lending library, that sort of thing. Yeah. But we had all the amenities that we needed, and it was very secure, I have to say. In fact, unfortunately, my father dying so young, but we really felt very, very secure. I have to say so.
Now, you mentioned that your dad had a telephone, and a lot of people
yes,
didn't.
my father was in business. He was a roofer in Tismouth who owned his own business, and as a result had to have a telephone there. There were many families in the community or in the neighborhood close by, because we were like a store, and then there was like 4 brick houses that had about 6 or 8 families per house, and many of these people did not have telephones, so they would use our telephone, and somebody would call and say they'd like to speak to so-and-so, and they'll call at such and such a time, and one of the kids was dispatched to this person's house, and they came and used the phone, or went to the candy store and used a payphone. But it was a method, and you didn't feel imposed upon or angry or anything like that. This was just one of the things you did for neighbors.
Right. Quite a difference from today, where everybody has a...
That's true. That's true.
Now, you mentioned when your dad passed, you went to work. Where did you go to work?
Well, the kind of work I can do to a warehouse, some very, very minor office-type work, but went from one job, it was a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and so on, but never got. And I had an uncle who had a dress factory. He was a subcontractor and manufactured dresses. And he took me in. I was taught how to use a sewing machine. I became a member of the union. And during those 3 years that I worked before I went into school, I was able to make a fairly decent living, in a sense. And again, it was something that was necessary to do,
Right.
and not angry about it or anything. I was very, very busy because I would work during the day and then go to school in the evening. And I graduated as I should have. In New York, you took Regents examinations. They had us taking Regents examinations and graduated.
Well, that was good, huh?
Yes.
Now, did you have any brothers and
Yes,
sisters?
I have. I was one of 4 children. I had 2 other sisters, an older and a younger, and I had an older brother.
You mentioned one of your sisters was actually from Czechoslovakia, was it?
Yes, my oldest sister was born and came here as at a year of age.
So your mom and dad were immigrants?
Yeah, they were immigrants, came around 1920, yeah.
And they became citizens?
Both of them became citizens, yes. They were citizens of the United States, yeah.
And you mentioned that they had to go through schooling to...
Yes, in order to take their citizen and so on. They were both well versed in reading and that type of thing. You know, we always had books. We had newspapers in the house. They were foreign Jewish newspapers as a rule, and they were always present in the house. And we had radio and we had news and that type of thing. So that going to school was not that far in a concept to them.
Now, was English spoken? I mean,
when we got older, English became the major language.
Yeah.
I'd say we were probably Jewish was our first language in the home. But after that, once we went to school and so on, English became our language.
Yeah.
Though we had a grandfather that lived with us, but he never became really English speaking.
Do you remember any of the Jewish language?
Oh, yes, I pick it up. If I go into New York for any length of time, it comes back to me. If you asked me, I couldn't do it. I pick up a word here and there, yeah.
Now, you said your dad was a tinsmith? And
A roofer and a tinsmith, yeah. And
you
had his own
mentioned
business.
he was on the verge of coming up with air conditioning.
Yes, some of the early work he did, I think if he had survived, he died in 1939, if he had lived, he would have been really one of the early people working with air conditioning. He recognized a need. The movie houses in those days used what they had air cooled. They opened up a roof and you had gigantic fans that rotated and changing the air, cooling the air. And he did some of the early work in the neighborhood with that. And he always said that he wanted my brother to become electrical engineer because he recognized, while he recognized the components that he could make, he recognized that there were electrical components to it that he was not familiar with. And he had wanted my brother to become an electrical engineer, which he eventually did do that, yeah. But if he had survived, I think he would have been one of the early things in air conditioning because he did recognize that. I also, as a youngster, remember inventors, the window which you opened up and twirl around and wash and that sort of thing. I remember seeing prototypes of that when I was a child that people would bring to him and he would do the metal work for it. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yes, yes.
Now, was your dad a veteran?
A veteran of the Austro-Hungarian Army, World War I, yes.
Now, you mentioned he was captured by the Russians.
Yes, he was captured by the Russians, and then in 1970, he said one day they just said go back home. And that was in 1917, but apparently it was captured in 1916, 1917. Ended up in southern Russia somewhere, but unfortunately, we never took that kind of an interest and should have really pursued it and gotten that history. As they say, going back to your roots.
Right.
Yes.
You did mention, though, that your mom said something about when he come home.
When he came, he walked back from southern Russia, I'm sure between carts and so on. And my mother always mentioned that when he walked in, he looked like a ghost.
Yeah.
Yeah, a ghost that came in because they were engaged in 1913. And then in 1914, he was drafted into the army before they were married,
Now, you mentioned you did graduate from high school. And
yes, graduated from high school and then went into Kings County Hospital, was a city hospital at that time. It's not, at the present time, I think it's Downstate Medical School. It has become Downstate Medical School in Brooklyn, New York. and we graduated from I went to school there. And
now you mentioned going to the county hospital. You didn't have to pay tuition at that time?
The tuition was very minor,
I see.
and that was a very important aspect
Right.
to it, yeah. And we were given an allowance, $20 a month, of which $10 was kept, and that $10 bought our uniforms, our books, shoes, and things like that. And the other $10 was given to us for an allowance. And there were girls, I was fortunate that I had a working sister, so she'd pass me $1 now and then. But there were girls that came in from Pennsylvania, the coal mining areas in Pennsylvania, that lived on that $10, and that's all they had. Probably saved on that too.
Yeah. Now you mentioned your uncle was a little upset when you left him to go to school.
Well, I had I was part of a very extended family. My mother had 11 brothers and sisters, and they were very upset because they felt that I was leaving the family in a lurch going to school. But my sister and my brother at that time was already in service, and my brother and my sister and my mother all encouraged me to go. Because in those days, if my mother hadn't said, no, you can't go, I wouldn't have gone. That's the way it was. But I have to say, I was very fortunate, and they encouraged me. My life took a whole different turn.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned while in school you joined the Cadet Corps?
Yes, after 2.5 years, the United States Cadet Corps came into being, and that was to encourage. It was kind of like a small military background to it. We had a uniform, but they provided income. You got an allowance and so on for going, and I joined my last 6 months in nurses training. I joined that, and as a result, spent 6 months in Staten Island at the U.S. Public Health Hospital. The Maritime Service used that hospital, and spent my last 6 months of nurses training at the Maritime Hospital.
So that gave
there.
you a little experience?
A little experience above and beyond the
school,
hospital, and some of the sailors and so on that came with the Maritime Service use that hospital.
And after graduation, where did you go to work?
I went to work. There was a neighborhood hospital, and went to work in that hospital, which is still in existence under another name, and worked in the maternity.
And that was the Israel Zion?
Israel Zion Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. It
Now,
became Maimonides Hospital. If anybody sees this, would know it as Maimonides Hospital.
That's what it is today?
Today, yes.
So, did you draft, or were you enlisted into the?
No, we enlisted. I finished my nurses training in January of ' and that May went into service, signed up for service,
So how old were you then, B.J.?
Let's see. It's hard to tell because 24. I was probably about 19 when I went into nurses training.
Right, so it was about 22
19.
when you went into the service?
About 22, yeah.
And do you remember your dates of service?
May of '45 to January of '47.
And do you remember where you were inducted? I mean, was it in the city?
Fort Dix, New Jersey.
So you went to Fort Dix for your boot
for basic training, and
Okay. And why did you choose the Army?
Well, being a nurse, that was the Army Nurse Corps, U.S. Army Nurse Corps.
You mentioned too that your brother was in.
My brother was in the Army. He was in the Communications Division. And my sister was engaged to a fellow who was in service at that time. Howard was in service at that time. So it was just
kind of a natural
natural sequence of events, yes.
You also said, too, that what was going on in Europe that you were hearing from there, it kind of
yes,
made
at that time. Well, being Jewish, and of course the stories of the concentration camps were being released. The war in Europe was over when I went in practically. I think, I don't know what year they finished, but the war, I think, in Europe was over, And I may have been on 42nd. You know that scene where the sailors and so on? I may have been one of those people
you
on
weren't the one that kissed the
42nd
sailor,
Street.
though, huh?
Maybe. No, I wasn't. But the war was over, and of course the newspapers and the paper, everybody was coming out with the things about the concentration camps and what had happened. Yeah. Though we knew of it before because we had in the family refugees that had come in prior to 1940, 1939. So we did know about what was happening in a sense, because we had contact with people who had gotten out late out of Europe late in 1939, 1940. So it came out, but it was exposed. The thing was exposed. Yeah.
Now you also had a friend that went in.
A friend and I went in together. Yes.
And you were sent to Fort Dix.
Yes, both of
New
us
Jersey.
had basic training at Fort Dix.
Do you remember any of the training you got there?
Well, we had to march. I do remember marching. Hella was very smart and got herself a blister, and she drove part of the way. I had to march. I can't recall too much. I'm sure we were shown how to use guns and that type of thing, but I don't recall too much of it, yeah. And
you remember most of the instructors were men, weren't they?
Yes, in the Army, yeah. They usually had a nurse soldier that was in charge of your unit because you were in the nurse corps, but most of the instructors and so on were male.
Did you find it hard to adjust? Do you remember?
Not really. I think being in nurses training, you had almost a semi-military life, so I don't really recall it being that difficult.
Yeah. And the cadets probably helped you
a little bit, but there was nothing massive of that. That was just individual, and each school handled their own thing.
Yeah. Do you remember how long the basic training was?
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Things, I think.
Do you remember graduating?
Yes, I had pictures and so on of the scenes of graduation, but that's about all. My mother came down, very proud of us. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. Did you get a furlough or go home after?
I can't remember. To be frank with you, I don't recall.
Okay.
I don't recall. I know we went because we finished up in May, and I remember we were still in winter uniforms when we went to Atlantic City, and it was hot. So it was still during the summer that we went to Atlantic City. Yeah.
So that's where you went next? Was
yes, we were sent to Atlantic City. The big hotels there were converted to hospitals. Yeah, Halloran General Hospital.
And which one did you?
England General Hospital.
General,
yeah.
And what was your job there?
Well, the main focus of that hospital were amputees. So that was the main focus. Also, we did some work with paraplegics at that time. Previous to that, if you were paraplegic, you really had a death warrant. It was the massive amount of effort to try and keep. We didn't have techniques. We didn't have the antibiotics because they were so subject to infections and so on, respiratory infections, urinary infections, and so on. We didn't really have anything but sulfa drugs to work with. And then with penicillin coming in, we had a better, to treat them, we had better medications to treat them. And we were also, they started using team approaches, in which they had a corpsman, they had a physiotherapist, they had nutritionists, they had physicians, they had nurses. So they had people, they had occupational therapists. So they used a team approach for them, and in many cases were able to provide a sort of living for these paraplegics. And they were able to survive and go back into the civilian life, which they never could before. And also, as I said, the major focus there were amputees.
So they would do the prosthetics for them?
The prosthetics there, and shoes and that type of thing, the walking, the physiotherapy. Again, having such massive amounts of people with this, they were able to find methods of physiotherapy. The techniques used to make the prosthetics and so on were improved upon. Unfortunately, it took a war to bring these kinds of needs to the surface.
Now you did mention penicillin, so that was basically you were there.
I could recall one of my classmates developed tubercular pneumonia, and spent almost 2 years in the infirmary at the school. In the School of Nursing. And the Army release of the first penicillin I ever saw used was released for her care. Unfortunately, it didn't help her. She was too far gone. She did end up dying. And, but the penicillin, that was the first penicillin I saw used.
Do you remember how long you were there?
Where?
At the Atlantic
City. I'd be frank with you, I couldn't give you exact dates. I'm sure if I went through it, I could find transfer orders. But I went from there to Fort Jay and Governor's Island,
But while you were there, you said that you got to see Beth Meyerson?
Oh, yes, that was the year Beth Meyerson became Miss America, and I remember the parade, and I think I have pictures of some of the nurses marching in the thing, and we had the Army Nurse Corps also had a float.
Then you also mentioned you went to Philadelphia to...
Oh, yes, we were able to get tickets to the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. So we went down with a group to Philadelphia and saw the game, and then we went to see the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra, and then we went out, I think it was Bamberger's or something, but it was a famous restaurant there at that time to eat, And you also mentioned the Queen of England came? She came and visited there. Of course, I didn't have anything to do with it, but we must have seen a parade or something in her honor,
An important story you had there was you met your husband there.
Yes, yes. I was there in the winter because I remember that's when it happened. I slipped on some ice, now that you bring it up. I slipped on some ice, and he was right behind me, and he helped me up, and my girlfriend knew, the nurse I was with knew him and introduced us,
Now, you did mention that he liked you quite a bit because you could get tickets to
that was his impetus, I think, for dating me, was that I could get tickets to the wrestling matches, and he was always very fond of wrestling matches.
And that was because you were an officer?
Yes, evidently.
Now, that wasn't fraternized upon at that time?
Well, evidently not, and I really, we didn't seem, though actually I think other than an occasional day, we knew each other, but the concept of it wasn't something that became that serious at that time until I left, and then we corresponded and that sort of thing.
Now, you did say that they would put on, you'd have social events.
Yes, they encouraged, they were very much, as you talk about fraternization, they were very much encouraging for us to take the young men out, because many of these young men had gone into the Army at 18. Here they were 21, 22, having been prisoners in Japan. Some of them had been prisoners in Japan, coming back and so on with amputees and so on. So to try and get them back into the world, in a sense, they did encourage us if there was some religious thing or something of that nature, or a general dinner there, to sit down at the table with them and share their thing. They wanted to get them as quickly as possible oriented back to the world that they were.
Sure. So from there, you said you went to Fort Jay?
Fort Jay in Governor's Island,
And what type of hospital was that and your duties there?
The duties there was a more general hospital, but they were just general medical care. We did general medical care there. And then that was more, it wasn't an amputee hospital, it was a hospital with day-to-day. There were some veterans there, and there were day-to-day care of the personnel on the island. Not, as we had amputees in Atlantic City, here most of the patients were the day-to-day care, that somebody got sick, somebody got pneumonia, that type of thing. Yes.
Was that considered a military hospital?
Yes, it was a military hospital,
Now, you had an important person there.
Yes, General Pershing was there. Must have been in his 90s there, and I remember taking care of him, but day-to-day care, but he was quite elderly at that time.
Yeah.
But World War I was there.
Yeah, yeah, that was exciting.
Yes.
And so then you also mentioned that you had a patient with leukemia, which was kind of
yes, at that time he was a physician, and he came in, and we really didn't have much we could do for him. And he eventually did die, but he was taken care of that. We didn't have the massive amounts of cancer at that time. Again, maybe it was a young population, and we didn't see the massive amounts of cancer that we see at the present time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's come a long way.
Yeah, it's come a long way. And leukemia was a rare thing. It was a rare blood. It was known as a blood disease rather than a cancer of the blood. Yeah. We were thinking of it as a blood disease. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned, too, that you were kind of close to home being there, so
yes,
you were able to go.
Because many of my cousins who had been in service were being released at that time, and we were coming and going quite a bit. Yeah.
Once in a while, you'd miss the ferry back.
I shouldn't mention that. It was a young world, and we were young at that time. Yeah.
So how long, do you remember how long you were there?
I really couldn't place it. I'm just trying to think. It must have been, you know, I really should have sat down and put which I didn't, and put the dates down, because I must have the,
I mean,
because I have
you were there for
papers.
months probably.
Yeah, yeah, for several months, but then they transferred us, yeah.
Then you got transferred to...
Because the Army was downsizing, the services were all downsizing, the war with Japan was over, and everything was downsizing at that time, yeah.
So where did you get sent to?
From there we got sent to a place called Greenhaven, New York. It was near Ossining, and it was actually a prison hospital. It was a small, perfect little hospital in a prison, and we had American soldiers who had been raped or thievery or whatever service. We had them. We also had some German prisoners of war there at that time. They were still there, yeah.
Now, so what was your duties there? I mean, what type of nursing?
We just general again, the general care. Anything really seriously ill, they were shipped out to a more regional service center. But we could take care of minor surgery, illnesses, and that type of thing, yeah.
You did mention that some of them probably did have some mental, maybe...
I think as I recall, and I'm just making a judgment at this stage, but I think probably the fact that we had some German prisoners of war still present there, they must have been mentally ill, and this is where they placed them. I can't swear to it, but there may be. But I have to say the focus on mental illness was not as prevalent with World War II as it was, because I was not in a psychiatric center. And not as prevalent. I think the fact that these prisoners were still there they must have been either very difficult individuals to take, and they were put in the prison population. They did not mix. They were kept separate from the U.S. U.S. Army prisoners, soldiers, yeah.
And you said that it was a very difficult place.
It was difficult. They had we always felt that they should have sent male orderlies or male nurses there. This was not the place, and we were not given any kind of preparation for dealing with this type of individual. And you do need a certain amount of preparation. But we were kept very isolated in a sense. If they were in the hospital, but we really did not mix in with the general population at all. Yeah. If they were in the hospital, then we took care of them, but other than that, we didn't.
But you said a lot of the nurses that you replaced had difficulty.
I think the nurses that we replaced were I think, alcoholics. They went. They may have been regular Army, U.S. Army service. The Captain Adams was regular Army. She had spent several years in Alaska as a U.S. Army nurse, and she was regular Army. Yeah.
And she was all Army, you said.
She was very regular, but that's the way. That was it. Yeah.
So because of the difficulties, you chose to resign?
Well, at that time, they were downsizing. And I shouldn't say difficulties, but the fact that it was ready for downsizing, and we really, I had never intended to stay in the Army longer than it was necessary. The wars, both wars were over, and they were downsizing the services.
Okay. Yeah. So you just decided that
was the time.
Good time to get out.
Yeah, and spoke to the colonel, and it was probably the time. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned too that your commission was a temporary.
That was
that's the way they assigned
That's the way
it.
they assigned the commission. Was written as a temporary commission. Yes.
So where did you go for discharge? Do you remember?
At Fort Dix.
You went back to Fort
Dix. Yes.
Do you remember any of it? Was that a...
Not too much.
No.
I really can't recall. A lot of living has taken place since then. Yeah.
Well, was it hard for you to adjust back, do you remember?
Not really. We had about a month's leave, and then I went right back to Israel Zion, back to my maternity, and went on living.
Now, is that when you corresponded with your husband, and then
Yes,
eventually...
we corresponded, and he got out of the Army before I did, and then he went to Chicago. He went back to school under the GI Bill, yes.
You also continued your education, you said.
I didn't, right after the Army service, I didn't continue, but later on I went back to school, yeah. I went
Did you
back
use
to
the
school.
GI Bill? Or?
Not really. I used the GI Bill for 1 or 2 courses, but then was involved with getting married. We were involved with, my husband went back to school. We moved to different cities, so became very involved. But then later on, after I was in Pittsfield for a while and so on, went back to college, went back to Russell Sage and got my bachelor's and my master's degree there. Yeah.
So how did you get to Pittsfield? How did that?
Oh, that was an interesting thing. My husband was already established in Framingham, Massachusetts, and we came, we were going to Montreal on vacation, and the AAA sent us with Route 9 through Pittsfield, up through Lake Champlain and Vermont into Canada. And while he was here, an optometrist had passed away who was an expert on cross-eyes. You know, in those days, they dealt with cross-eyed with exercise. They didn't do surgery at that time. And my husband said, gee, I'd kind of like to see his library and see what he might have in the library on books on cross-eyed. So he contacted, while we were passing through, he contacted the widow and got to talking and found out that the practice was available. By the time we came back, we went up through New York and came back through Pittsfield, going back on Route 9 to Boston. He said, you know, I think I'd like to. He had made up his mind he'd like to do it, and I had no objection, so.
So that's how you
That's how we came back.
to Pittsfield.
That's how we came to Pittsfield.
You said he was from Worcester to begin with.
Worcester, Massachusetts, yes.
So you ended up getting your master's, and what did you do?
And then went to work for Berkshire Community College. I taught on the faculty. I'm a professor emeritus from Berkshire Community College, yeah.
And how long were you there?
About 20 years, 19 and a half years, yeah.
Now, you did say your husband passed.
My husband unfortunately passed away, in 1983, yeah.
So did you have children?
Yes, I have one daughter. I have one daughter, and I have 5 grandchildren.
5 grandchildren, wow.
Good dividends.
Good for you.
Yes,
And,
yes.
So did you join any veterans groups?
Through a very nice gentleman who you've interviewed, was very persistent, and I joined the Jewish War Veterans. Yes, yes, that was the group I joined. My husband belonged to the regular Veterans Association.
The Legion.
The Legion, in Pittsfield,
Did you keep in touch with any of your...
No, the friend that I went into service with, we were close friends, and we always stayed close friends. We were close family friends, and very, very close to this day.
Well, that made it nice.
Yes, yes. It's been a wonderful friendship.
Yeah.
Yes. Both with great interests in common.
Good. Did you feel your experiences were had a positive or negative effect?
No, I think it was a positive effect. I was glad I was able to perform that service, you know, for the Army. It was not, the Army was not detrimental in any way for me, and I think it was a very positive experience for me. And of course, meeting my husband was an added bonus.
That was a big bonus.
It was a big bonus.
Sure.
Yes, we were very happy. It was a big bonus, and I think the experience was good. Yes.
Good. Well, Bea, I know we have some photos to look at, so why don't we do that
If you'd
now?
like to, yeah.
Okay. And what is that picture there, Bea?
That's at Fort Dix during basic training. There we are.
Is your close friend there? Or?
Yes, probably on that picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. There we are.
There you
That's
are doing that.
Helen and I, yeah.
That was Helen there?
Yeah, that was Helen behind the gas mask.
The gas mask. So you had to do that type of training?
Yes. Well, in those days you did have, we didn't know what was going to happen,
Right.
so gas masks were part of the training.
Yeah. That was just that's still in boot camp there.
Yeah, that's still, and you could see barrack type of,
Yeah.
That was a graduating
That's your
class.
and that's what you remember, graduation.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, that was a pretty big class, though.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the boardwalk there.
Now this...
And and this must have been Bess Myerson, because you see there's a float behind it. It
Oh,
was a
yeah,
regular
yeah.
parade. So this must have been the Miss America parade at that time.
They still do that on the boardwalk, don't they?
I imagine
think
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
They were sharp looking. And that's, as I said, they encouraged the young men to take part and young women to take part, because they had to bring these young men back to living. Yeah.
And this was still in Atlantic City, wasn't it?
Yes, this was in Atlantic City. And that was the chaplain, yeah. That's the Cadet Corps.
That's
Yeah.
oh, that was when you were in the cadets.
Yeah, in the cadets,
Okay.
they had, that was the uniform. Yeah.
That's a nice picture.
And that must have been a graduation picture,
Yeah.
From nurses
From,
training, yeah. And that's my brother. And that must have been in Europe, because he was in Europe. Yeah, when I graduated, he sent me from Paris, you know, perfume and so on. He sent me a bottle of perfume from Paris, yeah.
So he must have been over in
he must have been
France
over
or somewhere.
there, yeah.
Yeah.
He was in communications.
Yeah.
And those are my husband and two of his brothers who were in service at the same time. My husband is the middle gentleman. His brother is Jack, and Phil is on either side.
What did your husband do in the
My
service?
husband it was an optometrist, but in the Army he had a law degree, and he was hoping to get into adjutant general, but he didn't, and so, but he could type, and anybody that could type was so he ended up usually in the office, working in the office, office. That's before they didn't bring the wax there. I was kind of surprised. Yeah.
Now were his brothers overseas?
The one on his, on his right-hand side, Jack, was in the Battle of the Bulge. He went overseas and he was in the Battle of the Bulge. The other one on his left-hand side was stationed somewhere up in Maine, as far as I can tell, either in northern Maine, close to the Canadian border, doing something with communications.
Yeah.
That time.
Yeah. So the whole family was involved. There
were three sons in service at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the way I guess it was back then, obviously.
Yeah.
But,
I don't know what year that was. To be frank with you, my husband must have brought that with him, but I don't know what year that was.
Well, Beav,
That's it.
It was a good story, and we appreciate you taking your time to come out and tell us about it.
Thank
you for your service.
And I think it's as I said, I think it's a very valuable adjunct to a very important period of our lives. I'll tell you something. I honestly must say that when I think of young people now, I think we had a much more, we had a lot of living, we did a lot of living.
Yeah.
I really think so. But.
Well, thank you for your service, and thank you very much for participating.
Okay, you're very welcome.